positive impacts and negating the consequences of trauma. Can you give some concrete examples of social interventions that work?
Sure. So I can describe a little more about the ones that came up in the review article we worked on in the last example I gave that was set in rural Georgia. Those were largely interventions that involved parents and the children together. A couple of the examples in our article were only focused on the children and happened within the school setting. But by and large, the majority of the studies that have been tested so far to look at stress response physiology have involved two generations, so the parents and the children. This question, I think, actually links somewhat to the first question we got about interventions. To me, the first example that came to mind is Harlem Children's Zone and other iterations that we see where we really need to just be sure to be taking a two-generation approach to these issues and understanding that there's a role for teachers, for parents, for communities, and thinking about the right place to be intervening and multiple levels have to be considered here. So I think that at the moment, in terms of specific interventions, you will see, for example, if you were to look at our review, there's a lot of variety across the types of interventions that were shown as effective, but I believe that it would be possible to boil some of them down to look at common themes and a strong relationship with some adult is very common theme. It doesn't necessarily need to be a parent.
I have a question for Dr. Lee, actually. You were talking about the cortisol levels in adults who have experienced childhood trauma or adolescents and adults, it being lower, I guess, than an established baseline of some sort. Then what would be, understanding the whole cortisol, the concept of that stress hormone, what would be the consequence of that over a long period of time physiologically? Is there a negative consequence? Is there, usually we're told that high levels of cortisol is not good in the body. So what is the consequence over a long period of time, and how does that impact that person who has been experienced trauma?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. And we have some understanding of it, but there are some things that are still uncertain. So I would divide those consequences up into maybe 2 or 3 different categories. The first is inflammation, right? So when you have an inflammatory disorder, the treatment is a steroid, right? When you go to your doctor, they give you a steroid. And that's because it works. It reduces inflammation. And so we'll see patients often in chronic pain clinics who they have a lot of immune dysregulation and inflammatory conditions. They also have a lot of trauma. Often when we spot check their cortisol levels, they're low, and sometimes they're so low they get a workup from an endocrinologist, and they come back to us and we tell them, well, we think it's actually PTSD. So the first answer is increased inflammation as a result of low cortisol. It's important to think of cortisol as a mechanism of change as opposed to something good or bad. So one way low cortisol may be harmful is we talked about the brain levels of stress hormones being very high. So when peripheral cortisol is low, there is no longer a signal to restrain what's going on in the brain. And so my opinion is what's going on in the brain is you have these high central levels of stress hormones that drive abnormal social behavior. I call it abnormal. It sounds judgmental. But dysfunctional is a better way to put it. And I would roughly categorize that as mistrustful, overly suspicious, hostile.
Okay, great. Thank you again to our panelists.
Thank you again. They were wonderful. I just want to, during the transition from panel to panel, want to say a couple of things. First, I noticed people madly either scribbling or taking pictures of slides, which reflects our sort of capture generation. We see things and we want them. And I understand, we need them, and that's the purpose of a conference like this. So I just wanted you to know that we are going to do our best to make available to everyone all of the PowerPoint. And, right, subject, of course, to copyright. I want to say too, because I didn't adequately do this in my introduction of Dr. Markovich, that Alex worked with us. Well, she just finished her degree, but she worked with us, and among a variety of things she did with CLiME as a psychology student was to write up an amazing literature review, which really helped us to build the basis for presenters here today, but is also available on the CLiME website. So it's going to contain many of the studies that you've seen, but not all of them. And just to go one step better, she has also agreed to write up this conference. So you will not only have the benefit that's already there of her lit review, but you'll also have the slide decks and a write-up in brief of the various things that were presented to you. And one other thing I want to do, where is our panel? Where's the next? I had imagined as I was saying these things that the panel would just be seamlessly walking up. But while I have her here, and while it looks like the majority of attendees are here, I just want to make sure that another moment does not go by without my giving a heartfelt thanks. Do not escape, Catherine, to the person really most responsible. See, this is how hard she's working, right? Even as I thank her, she's distributing water to the people who are about to hear from. Catherine Peterson is really just a treasure. She's been with CLiME now for almost 2 years and is actually getting ready to leave CLiME and go on to do other things. But she is the heart and soul of this conference. There is no way that we could have done this today. The people you see assembled are people that Catherine has, a list of people Catherine has developed out of the literature, Catherine has assiduously contacted, kept in touch with, and made provision for. She is somebody deeply committed to these issues. She's a brilliant and kind person, and if I could just get her to stop for 1 second, take her back. Catherine Peterson.
The Wi-Fi.
Oh, okay, good, all right. And I guess you all know that the bathrooms are on the opposite side of this floor. And now, on to this next panel, and I'm going to just introduce in a sentence another of my colleagues, Esther Canty-Barnes, who has been a critical member of the Rutgers faculty for a very long time, works in the child advocacy clinic upstairs, education health law clinic, I should know better, and works tirelessly on issues, particularly involving special education, but with children in some of the most challenging situations in school. So no one better to moderate this panel than Esther. Esther, thank you.
Pleasure to be here this morning. I'm the director of the Education and Health Law Clinic, where we advocate on behalf of children with disabilities in various school districts throughout the northern part of the state. And many of the children that we do handle are children, when we look back, are children who have experienced very traumatic instances. We also work with children who are in foster care, which is a part of the colloquy that we heard this morning, and the impact of trauma. But you didn't come here to hear me speak about what I do, but we are very excited about the panel that we have today, because they come from a very broad array of individuals who have had experience not only in the educational system, but psychology, children and juvenile justice, and literacy. So our first speaker today is going to be Dr. Elizabeth Dutro. She is at the University of Chicago School of Education. She, her research has investigated literacy education for children's experiences in high poverty classrooms to the accountability policies in the reading, writing that impact those experiences. Research studies are also linked by commitment to educational equity, particularly for those children who have been least well served by public school districts. Her studies and findings emphasize the consequences of children's encounters with school literacy practices for their social and academic positionings in classrooms. She argues that we need to better understand both how to provide access to opportunities to achieve success in the ways that officially count in U.S. schools and how to expand what counts to include the knowledge and learning that cannot be captured in high-stakes assessments. She's also a former teacher, and she wrote well in an article that I looked at called Wounded Writers. I think that's the topic of it. And I hope she shares with her some of her experiences that led her to her research in these areas. Dr. Dutro.
Thank you so much. It is such a pleasure and a privilege to be here, able to learn with you all today. It seems like a nice flow from the previous panel. And I'm going to take us a little bit into the humanities and into classrooms. What a complex word, trauma. We know that as humans, we are quick to categorize things we encounter, and that impulse to label and sort starkly applies to experiences shared by, lived by, and assumed to be lived by children in classrooms. So an opportunity like today to pause on the word trauma and dwell on the question of what counts as traumatic is crucial for those of us invested in how life is lived in and through the layers of policy and practice in schools. Trauma is both the weightiest and flightiest of words, heavy with the certainty of hurt, loss, pain, despair, violence, yet afloat on the breeze of ambiguity of meaning and implications. Far from just an adjective to attach to experiences, its use is fraught in relation to children in schools. Children use their life experiences as an important foundation on which to build their school-based learning. This we well know. However, children's attempts to integrate their experiences within and outside of school occur amidst other evidence of their relationships in school that lie beyond children's control, such as the limited and inappropriate use of high-stakes assessments and long-standing false narratives of the educational disinvestment of economically struggling families and communities. Although many teachers are masters of actively resisting and recasting pathologizing narratives of children and families, that is not easy in the face of persistent class and racially biased perspectives in dominant cultural text, including the media. The work I've been doing with teachers and children in schools impacted by poverty focuses on how stories of children's lives, including trauma, circulate in highly consequential ways in classrooms. We wanted to understand how trauma functioned for children and teachers, and then design pedagogies together for literacy that wove relational, compassionate, humanizing, informed responses into the day-to-day of teaching and learning together. So today my goal is to share a little bit of that work with you and just a few illustrations of what we're finding together in that work with teachers. So my work on trauma and how it functions in classrooms draws on ideas from the humanities in trauma studies, an area of research that focuses on representations of physical and emotional pain in art, literature, the media, or other accounts of individual and collective human suffering. The traumas taken up in this work include both large-scale collectively felt events, for instance, the Holocaust or September 11, and small-scale personal experiences of loss, violence, displacement, and oppression. Although biological, psychological impacts of trauma are present and acknowledged in this work, the focus is the emotional, material, and political stakes in the narrative surrounding life experiences that might be characterized as traumatic. This is scholarship that traces the historical and contemporary traumas of racial, gender, economic, and heteronormative oppression, and helps us analyze the multiple ways that policy and the structures of schooling work to separate, label, position, and divide and conquer children and teachers in multiple ways. This scholarship centers critical concerns with power and politics as always present in how trauma is taken up in classrooms and other contexts of learning. So in this way, we advocate that educators resist arriving in classrooms with clear or fixed definitions of what trauma is, and rather turn questions toward the lived circumstances and the pedagogical imperatives of trauma in classrooms. So in short, the stakes are high in how traumas are defined, lived, and narrated in classrooms, particularly for children who live in poverty or with cruel immigration policies and with the racism that always positions them problematically in the structural inequities of schooling in the US. Although some of the areas of scholarship I'm discussing here today are not always central to discussion of trauma in schools, they offer a way to center on students' humanity, the knowledge that comes from lived experience, even the most difficult of those experiences. And as I'll discuss further, they trouble binary framings of aspects of schooling that are often thought of as oppositional, like cognition versus emotion, the academic versus the personal, or the healer versus the wounded. So why the need to take an interdisciplinary critical approach to considerations of trauma in schools? There are many of them. I'll speak to a couple of them. What's useful? One of the highly useful conversations central in humanities, scholarship, and trauma studies focuses on distinctions and relationships between shared large-scale events, such as natural or human-caused disasters, and more personally experienced hardships, such as the loss of a loved one or eviction from one's home, etc. All shared events also, of course, include many personal impacts. However, through their widely known and media-saturated familiarity, they also become shared experiences. So just one example, Hurricane Katrina was a natural disaster felt by a nation through images and stories in the media. In this way, it was a shared traumatic event that we might hope prompted empathy and despair. However, of course, each impacted child carried their highly personal experience into whatever post-hurricane classroom they entered. And further, that event's disastrous human costs were far from natural, exacerbated as they were by the actions of local, state, and federal governments. So personal traumas, in turn, are felt individually, but students and teachers carry those losses and disruptions into classrooms in ways that must then be viewed as a collective imperative, not only for the particular classroom community, but for the ways individual challenges are often connected to political systems and shared oppressions. For instance, a child's loss of a family member's presence to deportation must be supported and made to matter for that child's social and academic experiences, but is also part of shared histories and ongoing consequences of the politics of racism, xenophobia, and inhumane immigration policies in ways starkly apparent in the current moment. I know all of the schools where I do work, it's felt every day by children and families. This relationship between the collective and individual experiences of trauma provide a lens for teachers and researchers to consider the varying ways that members of classroom communities are positioned in various lived experiences that may be deemed traumatic. At the same time, we're very aware of how schools too often create and exacerbate trauma for some students. School experience can be the source of trauma, of course, and as I know so many will speak about today, that must be central to how it is addressed. And in our work, we're approaching that through the individual and collective stances and practices of teachers in the everyday teaching and learning in classrooms, and learning from youth like Diego in the quote about their experiences in school and all we have to learn. These are sometimes interactions that we've referred to as mundane catastrophes that happen every day in schools. So also, for good reasons, neurobiological impacts of trauma are often very much at the center of discussion. We've heard some reasons today already of how important that is to think about that. However, in medical-centered arguments about trauma, traumatic experiences may serve inadvertently as evidence of damage that requires healing or remain bound tightly to cognitive effects based on brain-based research. If mis or overused, that clinical lens can risk quickly and inappropriately pathologizing children or families. We cannot escape the dilemma that trauma-focused efforts in schools risk perpetuating pathology narratives about students and families. When I use the word pathologize, I mean it in its dictionary definition: to regard or treat someone or something as psychologically abnormal or unhealthy. It's important, of course, in many cases, to include a treatment lens and responses to the serious impacts of the kinds of life experiences children bring to schools. However, the stakes are high in those conversations because it is children from historically disenfranchised backgrounds who are most often positioned as in need of healing. Trauma comes with its bags already packed with notions of deficiency and pathology. Education as a system has been schooled to view some children's stories as already imbued with trouble and trauma. We know from decades of research that deficit perspectives of children and families are an immense and ongoing obstacle to students' access to equitable opportunity in schools. So any risk of exacerbating those corrosive myths through our work on trauma must be a paramount concern for all of us. In other words, there has to be an element of uncertainty in approaching trauma for all of the complex reasons we all get to consider through this conference. Taking up informed inquiry in partnerships and collaborations with one another, letting go of the myth of the silver bullet, can help us craft classrooms as spaces of connection and compassion, solidarity and advocacy that dislodge attention to trauma from singular narratives of damaged bodies of children, and shift the educational importance of trauma from single stories of impact on achievement and turn our focus to damaged systems and what to do about them. The question we've tackled with teacher collaborators is how to take up this need to both attend to trauma and trouble its use and impact all at once in the classroom. So I've been approaching trauma as an issue of practice in classrooms with teachers that's integrated into curriculum and instruction and in pedagogies that support deeply caring community. We've termed this approach pedagogies of testimony and critical witness, and a key aspect of these approaches is the idea of reciprocity and the critical analysis of how trauma and responses to trauma have very different stakes. The data examples I'll display as I talk are just some instances. These happen to be from a second grade classroom. This is a young white teacher who's taken up pedagogies where she is sharing vulnerably her own challenging experiences and then inviting children to bring their experiences into a context of care in the literacy classroom. So in these pedagogies by testimony, I mean the multiple ways children provide insights into their life experiences, including the explicit and overt, as well as the implicit and subtle. This includes children's talk and writing as part of instructional routines. There are informal conversations with adults or peers, and the embodied nonverbal silence, gesture, body position, facial expression, or the acting out in ways that disrupt routines or expectations for what school behavior should be. In turn, I use witness here to refer to how those testimonies children share are responded to and interpreted by those who surround them in schools, particularly in this case, their teachers. Our inquiry team learned ways to invite children to bring the full spectrum of their lives into school literacies and build the trusting mutual relationships required if children are to feel that invitation is genuine. We believe this requires reciprocity. Reciprocity means that teachers must lead with their own difficult stories, not because they will be the same as children's. Very often they are far from the same as children's, but to show that hard stories are present and welcome, that vulnerability does not lie solely with students, and to allow children to serve as witnesses to teachers' humanity. For instance, in a lesson on letter writing, Megan purposely focuses her modeled writing on a letter to her grandfather, and then in the slides you can see some of the children's writing across some genres that happens following those lessons in which a teacher purposely testifies to a difficult experience. At the end of the lesson, children are invited to write about topics that matter to them, with no requirement or expectation that it be something challenging in their lives. But by inviting children to witness a significant experience in her life, loss is explicitly included in what counts in school writing, and children take up those invitations, writing about the various forms separation takes in their own lives, such as deportation, incarceration, death, foster care, separation and divorce, moves across town, state, or national borders. But they also write of the joys of connection to family, to friends, to pets, to video games. In fact, we found that trauma and sources of connection and sustenance are bound up together in children's writing and talk. Children reveal the paradox of pain and joy in what is unquestionably painful. For instance, in his writer's notebook, Carlton brainstormed a list of topics for personal narratives, some of which represented lemons or difficult things, and then some of which children were choosing that would be kind of the sweeter lemonade things in their lives. His list of possible topics includes having cancer. He was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma at the start of the school year, having to leave his brothers when he was separated from his biological family, while his lemonade list focused on his foster parents' love and care, and that he can see his brothers more often thanks to his new life with his foster parents. His painful events have a counterpart on his sweeter list. He no longer has contact with his biological parents and misses his brothers, but he has been placed in a loving home and now is able to see his brothers. His cancer, a clear lemon on this list, didn't yet then have a positive counterpoint, but I am happy to say he went into remission at the end of that school year. We've also learned that it takes sustained inquiry and detailed analysis over time to see how children will integrate a traumatic experience into their school literacies. For instance, we can trace echoes of trauma across children's writing in response to invitations. As one example, early in the year, Enrique wrote a topic list, and his cousin appears on that list. And then later, he wrote a personal narrative in his journal where he's playing with the cousin, playing video games. And then he takes up the topic of death and loss, but it's about baby chickens his family had who died. And it's not until late in the year that he explicitly chooses to write poetry about the violent loss of his teenage cousin. So a teacher's testimony to difficult experiences in this way, we're finding, does not have to happen every day. It does not happen every day. But it does need to happen early, and it needs to happen periodically, as reminders to children that all aspects of life are valued as resources in this classroom. And such pedagogies require deeply connecting through shared experiences of the tenderness and fragility of human life and the conscious critical analysis of how human constructed disparities impact lives very differently and require active and activist advocacy for students and social change. Indeed, that explicit awareness of how power and privilege function in light of trauma is what we mean by the critical and critical witness. In our view, this indicates the absolute necessity of bringing anti-oppressive frameworks to our preparation of teachers and ongoing work with and as teachers. So this is the kind of work within the larger realm of trauma's presence in schools that we're talking about today that requires deep and ongoing collaborations with school colleagues, integrating the multiple perspectives we get to experience here today into the fabric of classroom instructional and management practices, relationships with children and families, and advocacy for justice. Professional development programs that we are seeing some in our state that districts bring in as infusion on response to trauma may be helpful supplements, but in no way can replace the integrated and long-term approach. One strand of my work is now in teacher education and trying to really integrate these perspectives and practices early on in teachers' experiences before they're independently in the classroom. We have a lot to learn about how to scale up and sustain such work in schools, but we're excited to continue striving forward. One thing we're learning with certainty: statistics, scans, and assessments of brain and body, those absolutely may have their place. But this is deeply heart work, critical empathic work, fighting for justice work, children as poets of their lives work. For as Judith Butler writes, let's face it, we're undone by each other, and if we're not, we're missing something.
Thank you, Dr. Dutro. We often use these methods also in law school, where we ask students to journal their experiences, their clinical experiences. So it runs a broad gamut, and it is really very effective in understanding what the student is really going through, which a student might not tell you orally, but it is impactful. Our next speaker is Trevor Melton. He's a graduate of Temple University, where he received his BS, and Rowan University, where he received a master's, and Wilmington University, where he received his doctorate in education. He is an education specialist in the Division of Academic Standards at the New Jersey Department of Education, and he is currently assigned to the New Jersey Governor's Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Committee, where he was appointed by the governor in 2012 to the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Committee, where he co-chairs and collaborates with a panel of representatives from other state agencies. Prior to joining the New Jersey Department of Education, he served as a highly qualified teacher in all aspects and capacities in the education of children with handicaps with the special education, and a guidance counselor, elementary, middle, and high school administrator. And he formed in 1994 a program called TKM Hoops, Sports Management Company, whose mission is to coordinate competitive basketball leagues and tournaments for adults and youth. Dr. Trevor, Dr. Melton, please come on.
Not yet.
Not yet. Well, I'm bringing you there.
Good morning, how's everyone? I'm fortunate to have a position at the Department of Education where I get to work with our Juvenile Delinquency Prevention Committee for the governor. But in addition to that, I also serve as a trainer for our Amistad Commission, which is our African American history that is designed to be taught into every grade level throughout the state, mandatory by law. So I'm fortunate to see and connect both parts of it. One of the things I want to ask you, how many of you are parents? Let me see your hands. Okay. How many of you in here have filled out those forms that they give you at the beginning of school that asked you questions about your name, your address, your phone number, and then you notice in that fifth one, it always asks occupation? Yes. We put with these forms on, as you were sharing earlier, some of the stuff we do in schools could be traumatic. Because now you have a young person that has to take that form home and may not be able to have a parent to fill stuff like that out. How many of you have kids that had to do the family tree activity? They ever do the family tree? That family tree activity, and I didn't realize it because I started my teaching career in Camden, New Jersey. And I was fortunate to be at a high school, then I got moved to an alternative school where all of my kids were on probation or parole. So I'm looking 28 years later, and I'm back in the same thing that I started, so that family tree activity, when I was an elementary principal, I noticed a lot of kids struggled with it, and their behaviors flared up, and there were other things that happened because they couldn't put that family tree together. I don't think any teachers realized what they were doing, but they did it because that's something they did every year in the curriculum. until I actually had to question, why are we doing this? Because we had a large foster care population in Willingboro, New Jersey, which we continue to have. So my next one is, how many of you have heard your kids come home and say they have to talk about what they did this summer? Let me see the hands. Come on, work with me. Thank you. Those activities sound very simple, but to some kids, they're very traumatic. So one of the things, when I got a chance to talk with Dr. Trout in the beginning of this process, I'm all over the state. I do 21 counties. And prior to it, I worked in our Abbott school office, where I was the intervention coordinator for 31 districts. And working within those 31 districts, I could clearly see some of the gaps where you want kids to learn, but you don't remove the barriers that inhibit them from learning. So I was fortunate once to do an activity with a group of new teachers, where the superintendent said, Trevor, I'll give you an hour and you can work with these new teachers. So I had all the new teachers dressed comfortable. After lunch, we started walking around the neighborhood. So we walk about 15 minutes until a teacher says, where are we walking to? I said, I want you to get a dose of what some kids go through every day when they leave school. They don't want to go home. They don't know what they're going to see when they get home. They may not have a home to go to. But yet we give them homework assignments and we tell them they have to do this. And when that kid comes to school the next day and the teacher says, where's your homework assignment? What did they hear? You're going to fail my class. I can't believe you didn't do your homework. That kid was worried about where they were going to sleep, eat, and wear his clean clothes the next day. So I'm fortunate in the sense that I didn't have those worries as a young person. However, I see kids every day in our committed detention status when I go out to our different places in New Jersey. And when I talk to some of these young people as to why they ended up here, they all come back to a traumatic experience. So one of the things that hopefully we're working to, most of our teachers in the education programs in the universities I have visited in New Jersey, and I was at Rowan University earlier, I was at Stockton last week, and I'm at Keene. I get around. When I look at some of the things on the education preparation of our teachers, you know, most of them don't do a social work class. Most of them don't understand. I was fortunate because when I was in Camden, I said, I can't service these kids. So I went back and got a degree in counseling psychology, but it didn't help the kids as much as it helped me, because I got a chance now to actually see some of the things that I was missing as a young person and able to service these kids. We were talking about policies and practices, and one of the things when you mentioned policies and practice, most of our school districts aren't set up to deal with kids with trauma issues. And when you start talking about overclassification and things that you see, I came into the Department of Education as an investigator in the Office of Special Ed. I was the only non-attorney. I walked into this and I was like, okay, I want to learn about special ed. And I had been a special ed teacher for 10 years before I got there. I didn't know nothing about special ed because lawyers interpret it totally differently than an educator would interpret it. But one of the things I did realize is a lot of things that we label kids as to have a learning disability was traumatic experiences that we just wrapped it up and put it into this bundle and said, this kid's got learning disabilities, which it wasn't. So when you start to think about it, a teacher that sees a young person, and this is one of the projects that I'm currently working in across the state, but I've hit several roadblocks. I work with our Attorney General's office and we serve 7 policy and planning boards, which we work with communities, education, nonprofits, higher education institutions, and we work collaboratively to build capacity to prevent children from going deeper into the school-to-prison pipeline. One of the things that we notice anyone here familiar with Cumberland County? Okay. Down in Cumberland County, where I was most of yesterday, we tried to come up with a plan when a kid sees a traumatic experience at home, and in this instance, let's use domestic violence. Young person sees domestic violence at home. We have a lot of blended families. We have a lot of single parents. That young person comes to school, they didn't do their homework last night because something traumatic happened in their household. law enforcement may have been contacted, but nobody tells the school district what went down. So we were trying to figure out a plan, and I think I'm pretty innovative, and I don't work well in the box. I don't believe in the box. So it does get me in trouble from time to time at the Department of Ed. But one of the things that I simply said, when a young person sees something at home, how do we notify the school? Think about it. How do we notify the school? A kid's house burned down, someone got shot, mom got domestic violence, dad got domestic violence. One of the things that we noticed was there was no conduit to get that information back to the school. And then, how many attorneys in the room? Let me see your hands, okay. No offense to the attorneys, I love you all. But once we got attorneys involved at the table, we came up with all these legal reasons why we couldn't disclose the information from law enforcement back to the school. So now I'm sitting with the prosecutor from Cumberland County, I'm sitting with a couple other individuals, and we're going back and forth as to, if a law enforcement officer sees that Trevor was involved in a traumatic experience, why can't the school SRO, school resource officer, simply go up and say to the principal, listen, Trevor saw something last night, let him come in and have a pass for the day. Let him speak to his counselor, let him, go talk to his case manager and child study team. We don't have those things in place. So what happens is, the teacher says to Trevor, where's your homework? What's my reaction? I just watched my mom get beat up. You asked me for homework. So now I get hyped up, I become aggressive, because that's what I'm seeing. I get removed from the office, to the office. And it starts that whole school to prison pipeline. As an administrator, I wasn't even aware of it, and I like to think that I was a little bit ahead of the curve, but I really wasn't. I saw that in middle school, I saw it in elementary school, but I also saw it in high school. It each acted out in a different way. So one of the things that, we're charged with now in New Jersey, we're doing, certain districts now are doing trauma-informed care for their teachers. And what they're doing is, I have a couple, I have one, which was Pemberton Township down by Fort Dix. What they did is they trained the whole teaching staff on how to identify it. Just identify it. Then the second tier was, who do we train from that point? We knew we had to train the guidance counselors, school nurses, school administrators, and a child study team. So that now, once you've identified, you can start to send it up layers. That's an ongoing training because it's not easy, because you have some people that want to do more than what they should. Teachers, I love them to death, but sometimes we take on more than what we should. We have to pass it along to those people who are better equipped to deal with it. So we're working on replicating that in multiple counties as we move forward, but anyone that